what I've noticed is on your tables you've got paper, and I'm a visual trainer, all right? So I thought what I might do is get you to do something for me anyway. So can you all grab a piece of paper off your tables? Let's do this for starts. So if you can all grab a piece of paper, blend in if you want. If you don't want to do it, that's absolutely fine. It's all good. And what I'd like to do on this piece of paper is imagine that you can, if it's not big enough, draw around your handprint for me. So draw around your hand for me. Okay, so just draw around your hand. Now, normally what I would do is I'd ask my young people and their carers and myself, we would draw around the handprint. But on this instance, obviously, you know, with the paper being so small, we'll get you to do your own. Could you put your name in the palm of your handprint? So in the wristy area, if you put your name for me. In the 4 fingers on your hand, can you write 4 things that you like doing? So if it was me, I like reading audiobooks, I like meeting new people, I like traveling. So 4 things you like doing in the 4 fingers of your hand, if you're lucky enough to have 4 fingers. In your thumb area, can you just put something in your thumb that you really love to do? Now, for me, it's my PlayStation 4. I do play Fortnite, so I admit it straight away. But I also work with children, so it's often helpful to be kind of in the same kind of interest they have. And actually, those of you that do know Fortnite, choosing skins is actually like looking at personalities that you use to survive. And so we can have the most amazing conversations while we're trying to be the one that survives. And again, if you're in the childcare system, often survival is the point. Now, you should end up with 4 fingers with things in and a thumbprint with what you love. What I'd like you to do now is to share that with the people on your table. See what you have in common. See what you have the same. See what you have that's different. And if there's any interest going on, try and key into that interests. And I'll tell you why you're doing that while we try and work out what we're going to do. Okay. So if any of you working directly with children or helping to get to know children, this hand exercise is amazing because people can't stop. You see? Okay. So I'll get your attention back if I may. Just a little interlude. Okay. If any of you assess children or look at children and their views and whatever else, often when you go and see them, the first thing they may be thinking is, what are you going to do to me? So doing this exercise, and I do this for all the children I meet on the first occasion, is what I'm really saying to them is, look, I have interests, you have interests, your care person has interests. I wonder if we look at all our interests, we can see what we have in common, what we have that might be might kind of cause discussion. But really what we're doing is sharing lives and sharing stories. And what these handprints allow us to do is to say that we all have stories, we all have things that happen to us or things that worry us or things we're proud of. And if we share those things together, what we're also going to have is, in my case, that I work with a adopted mum, for instance, and a child and myself, 15 story stems. And those 15 story stems, if you just listen to those stories, actually say, this is me and this is who I am. And once you can do that on that kind of field, you can find so many things about your young people that you may never have known. But equally, they find out so much about you that they've never known. There was a recent survey in the north of England where they asked children in the care system how many of them knew their social workers. And most children said they knew the name of the social worker. I don't know if that was well timed or not, really. But anyway, most of them knew the name of their social worker but knew nothing about them. Yet these people are making decisions for these children. So how many times have we lost the opportunity of sharing our lives with the children we care for or work with in order for them to feel it's okay for them to share theirs? And there used to be a thought in traumatized work, which was, our children are traumatized enough already, don't give them more things to worry about. Well, that's rubbish. Because it's been said by several people today, just in their presentations, which have all been amazing, is that relationship is key. You can use whatever modality of intervention you want. You can use any form of therapy you want to. But unless you have a relationship with that young person, you're not going to make much difference with them. So life story work for me is very, very important. There are lots of different ways to do life story work. And traditionally, we write children's stories for them. And then we give them in trust, in the hope that they make sense later in life. I work a lot with children where their adoption placements are under stress, maybe they're at risk of breaking. And what we find is that often the big problem is the life story book that was written for them at the very beginning of their journey, because it's never been updated. So you came into care and you were adopted because your mummy was poorly. Well, if that's all I've got, and therefore if you're poorly, you lose your children, when I'm 12 or 13 thinking about having a child myself, but hey, if I get poorly, do you see the problem? We have later life letters. I don't like later life letters. I'll put my hand up straight away. The trouble with later life letters is they often wait till too late. And so by the time we give the later life letter to a young person, they're normally 18. And then they realize that in being in adoption for the wrong reasons they thought they were in adoption. What else didn't you tell me? So you knew about all this stuff. And therefore there's a fracture in the relationship. So about 1997, I got involved in an organization called SACS, which stood for Sexual Abuse Child Consultancy Service. And my job was to create a life story approach. And so with the help of many children, many adults over the years, and now we're 22 years later, what we've looked at is a way we can reach our children using a therapeutic nature to life story work. Now, for my work, we don't work with any child under 5. So if you are caring for children under 5, we would work with you and help you understand the child's story that you're going to take into your family or your people that you would place children with, so that when they are of an age where they are asking those questions, the information is there, the processing is there, the story is there. So in Australia, for instance, in a couple of organisations, including the Benevolent Society and the Barnardos in Sydney, they're actually working with carers who are adoption ready, where they're working with the story of the child they're going to adopt, going through the whole process as if it was this therapeutic life story process. So when the child gets to about 7 and starts to say, who am I? Their adoptive mums and dads can actually say, well, this is who you are. So it's a really exciting time for me. But back to what we're here today, talk about therapeutic life story work. In a sense of this little phrase above my head. So this is Stephen King. Anybody read Stephen King? Good. If you want to be a good social worker, read Stephen King. Better than any psychology book, any book I've ever written, because what he talks about is people in a way in which actually makes sense. So this is from The Shining, and it says, the truth is that monsters are real and ghosts are real too. They live inside us, and sometimes they win. So how many of you work with families where they have monsters in them? Just a few brave people over there, okay. You see, it's not good to say that our children are monsters, is it? We kind of think, well, no, they've had monstrous things happen to them. And that's absolutely true. But actually, what are monsters? If you were to think about what a monster is for you, what is a monster? Anybody? What's the monster mean to you? Be brave. Fear, okay? So something that gives you fear. Anything else? Come on. Say again? So it can cause you harm, can be very, very frightening. It might cause you overwhelming fear. Anything else? Say again? So it's uncontrollable. So it's so big, it's so powerful that you can't control it. And it's substantial. So this monster is very big, powerful, scary, and fear. So what about ghosts then? What are ghosts? If I ask you what a ghost is, just ghost, what's a ghost? So it's insubstantial. It doesn't exist, but it has some authority. What do ghosts do? Scare you. Okay, so they have the ability to come up behind you when you're least expecting it and makes you go out when it says boo. Yeah? So it's maybe something from the past that's kind of hovering around a little bit, and every so often when something happens, suddenly you're overwhelmed and you're thinking, well, why am I overwhelmed? So, those of us that, have stories in our lives about smell, and we get that smell again, we automatically go back to where that smell came from. Or those of us that have had things happen in our lives at certain times in the year may automatically remember those things. Or some of us may have some things that have happened that we've not really resolved, we thought we had, but then someone mentions a name or somebody mentions a process, and all of a sudden that monster, that ghost, all comes back to come and say hello. Put it in a different way. How many of you work with or care for traumatized children? Should be most of you, if you have children not living within their birth family anymore. The biggest thing we have, if I was to say to you, if you ordered the top 3 most important things in your world, so the top 3 things that you hold most dear, So have a quick think. Just think of the top 3. All right, so for me it would be probably my family, probably my health, and probably my work, I would think, would be the 3 most important things to me. But probably in this room, I would imagine all of you have got family in your top 3. Would that be fair? So what if I could come home tonight and take your family off you, never ever give them back? How would you feel? Oh, that's okay? Okay, we'll do that. What would you feel like? You feel bereft, you might feel angry, you might feel so confused, you might feel bewildered, you might start to try and make sense of it. Oh, it must have been because I did this. You might be really angry at me, but I've gone. So who are you now going to be angry at? Whoever's left. Or yourself. You see, the problem is that we're all working with children that have had that most fundamental thing that defines us removed from them. And most of the time, it's not their fault. But most of the time, they take it on as is their fault. Because that's the only way in which I can make sense. Now, if you talk about ghosts and monsters, and you talk about trauma, the best description or definition of trauma I've ever come across is one that's done in Australia, called in the Australian Childhood Foundation, which is basically, trauma isn't what happened. Trauma is the residual left after what happened. It's the stuff that's left in us that has the ability to overwhelm us, has the ability to sneak up when we're least expecting it, and then create troubles for us. And if that happens, and I feel now vulnerable and I feel now scared, can the people around me look after me, or do I have to look after myself? Hey, I tell you what, if they can't look after me, all I need to do is bring a monster to the front, because that monster will look after me, because that will drive the people away, that will drive the things away that are making me feel unsafe, and now I feel safe again. So the truth is that monsters are real. And the truth is the ghosts are real too. And the trouble is they live inside every one of us in this room just as much as they live inside every one of our children. How those monsters manifest and why those monsters manifest, that's the big problem. And that's where we look at therapeutic intervention, therapeutic work. You see, if I can understand why I have this monster, I can be much more attuned to why this monster's there. And I can decide whether this monster's helpful for me. If I know that every Christmas I remember my birth family and I'm in adoption, and that overwhelms me and makes me want to destroy this Christmas because I need to in order to feel okay for my birth family, at least if I know that's what's happening and it's not about my family I live with, it's about those unresolved issues, then maybe I can work with those. So these very, very important parts of who we are and what we are is really at the essence of how we survive. How many of you do have monsters in you? Well, if you're not putting your hand up, I'm worried about you. You see, your monster is your defense system. How many of you shout and say things you regret straight after? Welcome to your monster. How many of you have road rage? Welcome to your monster. How many of you look forward to a drink at the end of the long day? Welcome to your monster. The trouble is when your drink becomes not quite enough, or when your day has to happen in order for you to have the drink at the end of the day. You see, the monsters and the ghosts are things that we need to be mindful of in order for us to work safely with our children, but also for us to work safely with ourselves. So with that in mind, we need to think about, well, how these monsters and ghosts matured. And what we think around is what Beverly James talks about, which is that all behavior is communication. And a lot of us work with young people who have the most amazing behaviors. And what's curious about these behaviors are that every single one, good or not so good, actually has a right to have that behavior if what feeds that behavior is not addressed. So if I know that to hit somebody in the head keeps me safe, why would I do anything different if I know it keeps me safe? But if someone can help me understand why I feel unsafe, maybe then I won't have to hit somebody because I understand that's what I'm feeling. So to connect our emotions to our behaviors to our causals, and understand the cause actually makes us make sense of who we are. So we do trees, we do behavior trees, and these behavior trees start with talking to families about what behaviors do we see. And we think around those behaviors. Now, when I work with young people, I'll go and see their carer first, who in my mind is the expert of the child. So I'll go and see the child's carer and I'll say to them, tell me, what behaviors do you see in this child's world? And so they'll tell me behaviors, and some of them will be quite challenging, like self-harm, maybe sexual behaviors. There might be issues around aggression, but there might be good behaviors that we think, are there that sometimes get hidden by those more challenging behaviors. They can be kind, they can be thoughtful, they can be caring. We have children with feelings, so I ask carers, well, what feelings do you see on show? Do they feel trusting? Do they feel safe? Do they feel they have someone that they can go to? Are they always crying? Are they very hesitant? Are they always anxious? Do they comply? Do they defy? All these kind of wonderful things. And what we're looking at really is, how does the child communicate what's going on inside their world? All these behaviors, as Beverly James talks about, is communication. So actually then, where is this communication coming from? So the next thing I would do is say, well, what do you know about this young child before they came to live with you? And here we're talking about roots. What are the roots of your young person that you're caring for? And those roots could be things like mental health, it could be issues around sexual hurt, it could be issues around self-harm or mistrust, or it could be rejection, it could be all these wonderful or terrible things. It could be about having a mum and dad that take alcohol or drugs, or having a sibling that's passed away. All these roots are the nutrients to our child's behaviors. So we identify these roots. And then what I do with my carers is to draw with them grass above the roots, to try to share with them that often we forget what these roots are, or sometimes we don't know what these roots are. But we know what the behaviors are because we see them. And we know what the feelings are because we endure them. But maybe we don't see the link between the two. And if that's not really gone home, then what I'll do is I'll draw the tree with a trunk. And this really helps carers and me and those around us to understand that we are what we were. That actually our life has developed into the way we manage our life. And those of you that work with attachment, which is one of my main areas, or those of us that work with, in this sense, looking at psychodynamic practice, what we're really saying here is that if we understand what actually kind of gives us what lies behind in what we produce up front, we can make sense of the world. So we are what we were. It doesn't mean we have to continue to be. But if we can understand what drives, what is behind these things that we present, we can actually help children and their carers to make change. Now, often I work with placements that are breaking down. And when I do this with a carer, I often will get the carer saying to me, oh my gosh, it's not me. Oh, it's not they don't love me. Oh, do you know what? I didn't realize that. Oh, now I understand why. And it can be quite a good eye-opener if you're, again, doing assessments with families about the fact that some of these behaviors, however intolerable they are, all have a right to be there if none of the other bits have been addressed. Does that make sense? So this is psychodynamic thinking. And if you look at it a different way, those of you that know what an internal working model is, so an internal working model is a Bowlby concept, which is now being kind of supported by neuroscience. Alan Shaw, who is a very, very famous neuroscientist, would say Bowlby got it right, all the way back in the late 40s, 50s, that the relationship we have in the womb to our mothers and in the first 18 months of life dictate how we see the life to be. Now, if you imagine that if this is the history, and history develops our internal working model, which basically says, am I lovable? Am I loved? And do I enjoy the world? Or am I unlovable? Am I at risk and in danger of the people that have care of me? Or is the world an unsafe place to be? If that's my internal working model, then I have got to develop practice and skills to keep me safe. And so some of these behaviors, however intolerable they are to you or me, may be the only thing that keeps this child safe, until they understand that there are things they no longer need to feel threatened by, that many of these roots have no longer got a connection to them. And this is life story work. Our life story work is about addressing the past so we can make sense of the present so that we can then look to the future. And as with Anna and, the Pause project, that's very clearly, what has happened in the past? How has that developed my understanding of the now? And what is it that I can do about that I can leave behind so I can move to the present? And a lot of this is extremely good work if you can have the child and the carer working together. So for my life story work, I don't work on my own with children. I only work with the primary carer. Because as someone said earlier today, and I'm sorry I can't remember who it was, but it was so good, which is that we don't fix children. Nobody coming into your families fix your families. What we actually do is give the opportunity for those families to fix themselves. All we are, if you like, are facilitators. We're there to hear, to make sense, to bound off, to think off. But really, at the end of the day, change isn't going to happen because you have a Richard going into your family. Change is going to happen because your family wants to change. And therefore, back to relationship. So these trees are really, really useful things. And I use these in court reports. I use these when I'm assessing families. Because sometimes the behaviours we have are behaviours we think we need to do when certain things happen. We never have the chance to actually think about the cause and effect nature of those behaviours. So again, therapeutic life story work isn't about where you lived here, you lived there, and this is why you live here. Therapeutic life story work is the meaning of all those things, and the impact of all those things, and the operational concept of all those things, and the way in which we might be able to manage all those things. So it's very much about bringing children forward. So here's a tree that was done by a little girl. She's 5 and a bit years old. This is her first attempt, and by the time we finished, there were 40 leaves on here. So sometimes I use wallpaper, sometimes I use real things. We use a lot of work with our children who have autistic spectrum behaviours, for instance, and challenges, and therefore we have to be very visual, we have to be very repetitive, we have to be very inclusive. But some of the greatest life story work I've ever seen has been done with children where I've been told previously they couldn't do this work. I think sometimes we are not able to see the joy of our children in allowing them to be who they are and expressing who they are. And this little girl here, for instance, was a lovely piece of work. And as you see, it's on this slide so you can see it so that there's no problem for her. I will show you something later on which you're going to help me with, and you can't take pictures of that. I'll explain what that is later on. And obviously with the camera, we've kind of done it so you won't get it on your camera, hopefully. So how do we do this work? Well, most of you, I would assume, I would hope, have heard of a man called Bruce Perry. Those of you who haven't, he's an amazing orator around trauma and the impact of trauma on the brain. He has a wonderful thing on YouTube called Born to Love. So if any of you are working with parents who are really struggling and why did we do this? You know, this is such a bad impact on our house, our family. Get them to watch Born to Love. It's a beautiful kind of, oh yes, that's why we do this. Perry and I met some years ago now, and he thought life story work was really interesting, but it would be done at the end of a child's recovery. And of course I didn't agree with him, which is absolutely fine. In 2012 he was very, very kind and wrote a foreword to a book I wrote about life story work. And in this book he basically says what I think we all know, which is actually if we can hear the child's story, if we can hear their narrative, and then help them to create a new narrative of their world, what we're really doing is looking at their core understanding of self, and then being able to expand on that core understanding of self to create a new and more helpful and healthy understanding of self. And Perry and other people now all seem to say the same thing, which is wonderful, that if you're doing any therapeutic work with a child, that young person needs a narrative core. You know, why are you doing this? What's happened to me? Do you know what's happened to me? Oh, now I understand why we're thinking around, you know, allowing people to get close to me. Now I understand why I have this behavior. Now I understand why certain things don't really, you know, kind of affect me in the way it should affect me. Why I don't get upset when I should get upset. Or why I get more upset when I shouldn't, and so on and so on. So having an opportunity to hear a child's narrative is the most wonderful thing to do. And this therapeutic life story work helps us to do that. So what we do at the beginning of our work, this is from a little booklet we do for our children of 12 plus, is that we, if sense me for a starter, my job would be to go and get information about that young person. So we used to say to children, what would you like to know if I went and saw your mum? What would you like to know if I saw your dad? We don't do that anymore because the children have told us that actually that's really anxious for them because I'll go away, see their mum or their dad, and then I won't see them again for a while. But of course they're left in, well, what happened and what did they say and are they going to see me again? And of course we recognize that that can be quite intolerable. So with the kind of lots of support from children back in 97, 98, we learned quite quickly that we need to find information first. So for all the children we work with, we go off and we get what we call an information bank. We don't care about truth and lies. They don't really exist anyway. We all have perceptions and we all have misperceptions. So as long as we collate all those, so mum said, dad said, social worker said, file says, judge decided, all those kind of comments, we can actually collate all those. So it's a bit like a big fragment of glass that's broken across the child's journey. And my job is to go and collect those fragments of glass, bring them all back together again so that we can then start to tell the child their story. But we need to do that once we hear the child's perceptions. So in a way, what we're saying to children that we're going to work with is Richard or whoever will go out and gather information so he understands what's happening for you. Now, the way we do this is really important because, like many other things, we understand that we need to hear our parents' voice. We need to hear the voice of our birth parents, our birth family. We need to hear the voice of those that have acted in the journey of the child. So how we do this is we use movement boxes. So we get hold of a transfer summary or a file, or we might get hold of a court report, or it might get hold of a core assessment or a child placement report, or maybe a Form E or a Form F. And we will break them down into bite-sized chunks. So literally we'll get a history document, which is lots of boxes on a Word document, and we will just break down the story into bite-sized chunks. The reason we do this is because often when we read something, we might assume something's happened that hasn't happened, i.e. this one here. So in May 2008, Casey's mum has a car accident, and in May 22nd, 2008, Casey's born premature. If you have no other information, what might you assume has happened here? Anybody want to take a risk? You won't be wrong necessarily. Yeah, there's a causal, it makes sense. You know, this girl's premature, mum's had a car accident, she goes to hospital, next thing we know, mum's had this baby. Okay, that makes sense. The trouble is it might not be what happened. But because it makes sense, that's what we write down. And this is the big trouble when we do life story work from files. Because when we do life story work from files, we've got 8 or 9 or 10 different social workers who've inputted that file, with 8 or 9 different ways in which they read what's happened. And now we've got a 9th way, i.e. my way, and all the way through, we haven't really understood the story of the child. So we have to actually make sense. So what I do in these boxes, and there's normally about 400 boxes, is I would then think, well, what would help me understand this story better? So I break down the boxes by saying, what do I need to know, and what might Casey ask me? Now I'm actually able to manage Pandora's boxes. So when the Pandora's box opens up and they say, oh, but I bet you don't know about, it might be that I could hold that Pandora's box because I might say, well, that's so helpful for you to tell me this. So let's write that down, and then perhaps we can look and see what other people thought about that. If we don't do this, and she goes home with a book that says, I was born premature because mum had a car accident, and then she goes to see mum or lives with mum or goes back to find out what mum was like, and then says, oh, this man Richard did a book with me. He told me I was born early because you had a car crash. And mum says, no, that never happened. I chose the wrong type of people then. I was with a relationship with a man who wasn't very nice, and he hit me the night before you were born. Or it might be I had a real problem medically, and there were some problems with my, my body, and I had to go into hospital, and you were born early because it was very important that you came out and you were okay. We just don't know the story. We assume lots. We don't know. If we have mum's story, then we have mum's story. And so again, celebrating adoption should not say this family they were in no longer exists, because this family they were in will always exist. So if we can use those stories from their birth families, and we can use those stories from those people that have walked their lives, we're no longer telling them, no, this is what you need to know. We're not saying to them that this is what other people said who were on your journey with you. And it's a lovely thing to do, and it's amazing, really. We break down our stuff into bite-sized chunks and then into a big kind of eco-map like this. All this is that I don't know all the information. I don't know this child particularly, but all these people do, and all this paperwork does. So if I just do those boxes, and then I do those questions, and then I just do a code, the box number and the question letter, I can then just, on this lovely eco-map, write 1A, mum, 1A, doctor, 1A, dad. Or I might have 36B, hospital, 36B, midwife, 36B health visitor. Do you see what I mean? And so now when I write to these people or see these people, I'm not saying, oh, hi, I'm doing life story work, what can you tell me? I can actually turn around and say, hey, this is a question that we've got. Can you help me understand the answer? And our experience tells us that if we give people questions, they're likely to answer. If we just say, what do you know, they're likely to put it off because they're thinking, what do you want to know? So we have a very systemic way of finding out information. And all this stuff produces for us a wonderful, rich information bank, which has the birth family stories, it has the social work stories, it has the allied services stories, but it also has the story of the child. And in a way, what we have now is what Michael White used to talk about, which is not just a narrative core, but the insulation of the narrative core that child's grown up with. And that really then helps us to make sense for them about their journey. So this is quite intensive, takes around 3 months, not to do, by the way, 3 months for everything to come back. But if we do it well, and it's taken us a long time to refine this, we're really there now, but we've made loads of mistakes to learn that on the way. But now that we know this is really, really quite competent, what we find is that we're beginning to understand the journey of our children, and if our carer understands the journey of the child they're caring for, they then can see why the child does what the child does. And then we can have change and we can have progress, which I'm hoping to show you right now. So once we have all that information, we then share the information with the carer. So I sit down with adoptive parents and I will go through the whole information. Because as we heard earlier today, sometimes not sitting and explaining, just expecting people to understand, doesn't really help. But being able to go through the story with the primary carers allows us actually to understand the story. It also allows our adopted mums and dads to react to what they're hearing, to get upset, to get cross, to get sad, to become animated, not with the child when the child hears the story, but with me while I tell them the story. Which means when it's the child's turn, the carer is then informed, she's aware, she's alive too, and she's able to hold that young person. So what we're really doing is making a partnership so we can help that young person. And again, relationship is key, which I believe is why this works so well. So if I can ask you to put the wallpaper up for me, that would be lovely. So we work on wallpaper, and wallpaper is our Bayeux tapestry for our children. So what I mean by this is that, those of you that know your history, 1066, the Battle of Hastings, Harold decided that William couldn't be the new king, he wanted to be the new king. And so William wasn't happy about this. And they had a war called the Battle of Hastings, in which Harold lost. And then William became William the Conqueror. We know about this story because in the town of Bayeux, northern France, they have a Bayeux tapestry, And the Bayeux tapestry itself, you know, all those years ago, tells us the story before, the story during, and the story after the Battle of Hastings. And I thought, why don't we do this with our children? So for our young people, they do about 6 of these. This is a young girl, she's 9 years old. She's given permission for you to see this, but not to take photos. And on this picture of this wall of this child, what you really got is her starting to make sense of herself. Now, if you look on the other side, so you're going to do something really clever now. You're going to kind of turn it over, so coordinate as best you can. I'm just going for an intelligence test now, look. Yeah, you almost got there. Not quite, almost. Well done. You see, it's a lot of stuff. And this little girl, when I first started working with her, was very angry. She was very much hurting her adopted mum and dad, and they'd had just about enough, really. We're very fortunate in England to have the Adoption Support Fund, and that funded for me to go in and do some work with this family. And she was able to externalize all this stuff, all these thoughts about who she is, where she is, why she is. We were able to tell her the story before she was born, able to tell the story of her grandparents, of her parents, of her older sibling, and then to her story. We were then able to think about her birth all the way up to coming into care, and then care going into adoption, and then adoption up to the age she is today. And all this externalizing means she's no longer carrying it around with her. Now, if you imagine a lot of your young people that you care for or you work alongside adoptive families, they don't have somewhere to put all this stuff they have in their history, so it's often contained in their bodies. And if it's something that worries them and worries them and worries them, then the more they're worrying, the less occupation they have for the now, because the preoccupation is all this stuff. And what we notice with our children is the more they're able to tell their stories, their hurts, their sadnesses, their happies and their accomplishments, the more we're actually able to allow them to take from inside here, somewhere safe, so that then they're able to take more presence in the world. They're able to take more risks and make friends. They're able to enjoy education. Now, a good way of explaining this to you probably would be if you grab another piece of those bits of paper. That's lovely, thank you, if you want to fold that up for me. So if you just take another piece of paper, and I'll explain this to you in a different way, but hopefully it'll make sense. If you could draw for me a bar chart. So all I want you to draw is a rectangle, a bar chart, okay? So just draw a rectangle, just a bar chart. So if you like, just a big bar chart, lovely, just like that, okay? And you want to stand it on its end because it's a bar chart. So, yep, lovely. Can you show everybody else? Because that's so good, right? Could you get like a bar chart, like it's dead easy, all right? So a rectangle. Think about school if you can go back that far. Okay, what I want you to do is this. Do me a favor. In your bar chart, so in the actual bar chart, could you write down all the things that are in your head that's got nothing to do with you sitting here listening to me? Just write for me in the bar chart all those things that are competing with you and your brain to listen to me. And as you're filling this up, hopefully not too much, what you're really doing is looking at what is preoccupying you, what is pulling you away from listening to me. Most of the children I work with will have a bar chart which is around 80%, which means their day-to-day life is spent with 20% actually able to make sense of the world. Do you see what I mean? So 80% is already somewhere else, and they're in a school, and they're in a classroom trying to listen to their teacher with 20% available to listen to their teacher. With other children in that classroom, they may have 80% availability to listen to that teacher. And then we wonder why some of our children don't manage classrooms. Well, it's because their bar chart is overfilled, and that means they're no longer listening to the teacher anymore because there's no more space left. And what they are listening to or trying to listen to is whopping out over the sides of their bar chart. And now they're at a disadvantage because they feel a bit silly. They might be a bit worried that teacher might ask them, did you hear what I said? They might be worried that all the other children seem to be getting their questions and getting the answers, but they're not. And then monsters come out because they're now unsafe, and now they act out in the classroom so that they get kicked out of the classroom, so they no longer feel vulnerable anymore. Does that make sense? How many of you sometimes listen to people and think, I've had enough now? Don't say it right now, but you know what I mean, okay? That's your bar chart. It's just overflowing. And if you think about it this way, the only reason we do that lovely wallpaper work is because all we're saying to kids is, you don't have to carry this around anymore. You can actually put this on wallpaper. We'll leave it at your house so you know where it is. But now you know it's safe because it's on that paper. And if we write it out, what we're really doing is sharing something by airing something. And once we do that, it's no longer as powerful as it was. Now, how many of you, for instance, do shopping lists when you go shopping? Why do you do that? So you don't forget. So you're not now worried you're going to forget something because you know you've got your shopping list. So if you write something down, then actually you don't have to worry about thinking it or remembering it because you've got it written down. Think about it that way for this work we're doing with our children. Writing something down allows them to actually externalize. Now we can try and make sense of this, and by making sense of this, we can see whether or not what we take back, what we internalize, is now much more safer, much more rich, much more informed, and therefore actually most of our young people can say at the end of the work we do, hey Richard, it wasn't my fault. Which is actually what we need to get with most of our children, that most of the things that have happened wasn't their fault. It doesn't mean it was their parents' fault. It doesn't mean it was the social worker's fault. But what it does mean is it wasn't your fault. Do you see what I mean? So wallpaper for us is really, really exciting stuff. It's 6 rolls often that children will do, so about 80 meters in length, which is interesting because that's not far off the Bay of Tapestry. It tells the story of grandparents, parents, and older siblings to the birth of the child. It then tells the story of the birth of the child all the way through to the current age, and then how the child sees their future. And when we're doing this, of course, we're starting to relate and make friends and start thinking about things. We use lots and lots of different things, including Thalberg's concept of direct work and listening to children, that in order for us to understand what a child is saying, we just need to hear the child. So we use lots of play, we use lots of different ways of playing. We use Jenga and squiggles, we use family trees, we use timelines, and all these things, these first bits of our work, is really up here. that if we can hear our child's perceptions of their world, before we start to say this is wrong or this is right, we can then say, what do you know? Now, social media is a big problem for us in adoption, because we know, in my experience definitely, many children that I work with are already in contact with birth family, but can't tell their adoptive family they're in contact with birth family. We know with the rise of DNA tests that many children are now taking DNA tests quietly because they know that their parents may be taking DNA tests. And so the DNA companies now put you in touch with the people that share your DNA. So it's really quite interesting where we're going with this story of who am I, where am I? And so for us also on social media, I worked with a 10-year-old little boy whose mum had killed somebody, and therefore he was in the care system. But he wasn't told that his father, who was no longer living with mum, also killed somebody. He found that out on the internet. So unless we tell our children the story, somebody else will. So we need to think about, is it right for this child to have a story that is thought through, that is prepared, that is as accurate as we can make it, but also informative as we make it while they're able to hear the story? Or do we wait for the story to come from different spaces, different areas? And maybe those stories aren't so safe. And certainly with my experience, I work currently with 12 young people. Of my 12 young people, 7 of those are adopted young people. And of those 7 adopted young people, 5 of them have been or are in contact with their birth family and hadn't told their family of origin, hadn't told their family caring for them. It's very, very powerful things that we see. And therefore, like Falberg talks about, unless we hear the perception of our children to help them, then how else are we going to work with them? So therapeutic life story work is a really wonderful thing to do in that way too. We work with children through preoccupation. We work a lot through feelings and emotions. We have things like this. This is our Think, Feel, Do Bear. We love our Think, Feel, Do Bear. A Think, Feel, Do Bear basically is our ability to reflect on and our ability to reflect in action. These are made in Australia. 3 people that were attending the diploma in Therapeutic Life Story Work, which you'll see there's a little sneaky advert on your tables because we're bringing it to Edinburgh for the first time in March. And 3 social workers who attended it in Sydney came to the next session and said, we've made this, what do you think? This bear has saved so many opportunities for me to get to grips with children's thoughts and feelings. I have a 17-year-old boy currently I'm working with who puts his bear on his shoulder. He doesn't play with it. He just rests it on his shoulder. It's the same weight as a blanket, kind of a close blanket. And therefore, he just rests it on his shoulder, and he will just use that as his security while he tells the story. And he thinks about his story, he emotes about his story, and he thinks about what he should do about his story. And he's taken that bear concept into his day-to-day life. So rather than creating a volcano, he often will say, I'm feeling really unsafe right now. I'm thinking it's because, can you help me? Because I don't think I could do it myself. It's a beautiful, beautiful way of working with children. So again, you can either use as a bear, IKEA, and just put a brain and some hands on, or you can use stencils, of course. Here's a stencil system here. Whatever you chose to do, what we're finding with children is if you give them the tools and you explain the tools, they're very quick to use them. And sometimes I'll have children who say to me, Rich, I used my brain today. And I'll go, oh, tell me about that. Well, you know that thing we do? I was thinking about my teacher, and I was feeling what it must be like for my teacher to have me scream and shout at her. And I was thinking, perhaps she wants to hit me, but she's not allowed to hit me. But maybe actually, if I did something different, she'd think differently about me, and maybe she'll feel differently about me, and then maybe I won't need to do what I think I want to do. I might want to, be good. And it's that simple, by the way, but it's also that easy for our children to make sense of. So a lot of this stuff really is based on play. We do lots of play work with children. We use lots of different ways of playing. And again, today's presentation wasn't to go through all these with you. It would take me too long. We are regularly brought up to Scotland by various organisations to do therapeutic life story work training for a day. So I know that Bernardo's may be doing something in the near future. Come on one of those days if you want to listen to this, or again, just go on the internet, you'll find stuff. But we use Jenga, we use squiggles, we use all these things just to get into the child's world. So those of you in this room, how many of you are therapists? Welcome. I'm not a therapist, social worker, but, always want to be. I'm a therapeutic thinker, all right? So therapists, we know, I imagine we know. I didn't know where I got this from, or I made it up, one of the two. The first time you see a child, they're curious about you. The second time they see you, they want to know what you're going to do to them. The third time, they want to see whether or not they can still have control, i.e. they'd be the worst of the worst. Now, that's not to drive you away, it's to make sure you're strong enough to be able to come back and be with them. The trouble is, many of us see that third time as being, oh, they don't want this, and we don't go back. But actually, it's like roller coasters. You know, if you go on a roller coaster and somebody puts your bar down on your roller coaster car, you're not going to go, okay, that's good. You're going to check out it's all right, it's still there. And your expectation is it's not going to move, it's going to stay still. And a lot of times in care, but also in therapeutic work and therapy, the child's doing the same thing. When they know things aren't quite right, or they're not too sure whether you're the right person, or maybe something happening in your family, they're thinking, can you still look after me okay? Well, they give you a big wallop to see whether or not you will still be able to keep them safe. Some of you will have families, some of you are in families where children will do things they haven't done for years. And you think, well, where did that come from? Well, probably if you look round your family, something's changed. That child's picked up that change and now thinks, do you still care about me? Can you still care for me? Can you still protect me? I need to know that, so I'm going to do something to see whether or not you can do it or not. Do you see what I mean? And all these things are what we do with our young people. We use timelines and all wonderful things just to help children tell their stories. We believe in Bronfenbrenner, and Bronfenbrenner is my little friend, really. We don't look at the ecological model. That's the thing that you all guys might like, the ecological model being the child, the family, the extended family. It's a bit boring, really. What I really like about Bronfenbrenner is every child needs an adult insanely crazy about them. And often when I go into adoptive families or foster families, that craziness is being lost, just momentarily, but it's being lost. I'm tired, I've had enough, I can't cope with this anymore. So my job really is to be that crazy person coming into the family and being crazy about the child I work with. So I work with children that are often 3, 4, 5 hours drive away, and I'll go and see them, and then I'll come home again. And one child I saw last week said, how far do you drive to see me, Richard? And I went, oh, it took me 5 hours. 5 hours? Yeah, you're worth it. Am I? Yeah, for me, you're worth it. And I'll go away again. After about 9 months, it takes 9 months to do this work on average, children will often turn around and say, I don't need you anymore. Or carers will turn around and say, I don't need you anymore. And it's the most wonderful thing to hear. A child I was worked with the other day, she wrote, there's Lily, the child you saw on a wallpaper. She invited me in to see her wallpaper, and she said, I've written something you need to see. And I went, oh, okay, what's this? And I read it, and it said basically, Richard's the person that helps families to come back together again. Richard helps us all to understand why we do the things we do, and that we can enjoy life if we just talk to each other. Something like that, it said. And then it turned around and said, but, you know, Richard, we don't need you anymore. And it was like my marching orders, but it was a lovely way of saying, go away. Do you see what I mean? Life story work, we have children and families saying, we don't need you anymore, rather than saying, we can't manage it without you anymore. So we have very little learned helplessness in this work. By the time we've told the story, and we've learned about why we're doing the story, we get families who actually model what we do. So you did your hands earlier this morning. I know time, so I'm going to be quite quick. You did the hands earlier with me. This family here, they give me permission to share with you this, but obviously you don't have their names. They were doing some life story work with me about a year ago now. And then about April this year, I had an email from them with this picture in. And I got a little thing underneath which said, thought you'd like to know, we're still thinking about how you helped us make sense of our family. And our little boy had a bit of a wobble. He's an adopted little boy. And so we decided we need to put our handprints together and think of the 15 things that keep our family happy and loved. But what we're really doing is trying to say to this family, you are. And once you have a family that understands they are, they can be whatever that family wants to be. But while we have children who are defined by their past, and families who care for children who are not sure about that past, they'll always be stuck in that present. And what we want is for families to be freed from the past, to understand the past, to move forward. That doesn't mean accepting, that just means understanding that this is what happened. We have children that say to me often, I couldn't change this, can I, Richard? And I go, well, we can't rewrite past, but you can write your future. It doesn't mean your future will never, ever have issues, but it means at least you have some mastery. But you can only really have that if you understand how it's got to where it's got to in the now. So what basically happens is we do all this hard work. We do lots of things around the child. I put all this stuff in for your presentation to take home with you. But this is something I want you to have a quick go at. It's going to take you 1 minute, and then I'm just going to share with you outcomes. So if you don't mind, on another piece of paper, if you're lucky enough to have one, could you just draw that for me? It's going to be really quick. I'm going to be 5 minutes. I hope that's okay. Can you write in the top left quadrant, what's true about you? You could decide what that is. What's true about you? It could be your age, your marital status, it could be your job, it could be you're kind, pretty, whatever you might want it to be. In the bottom left quadrant, what do people say about you? What do people say about you? So do they think you're kind? Do they think you're thoughtful? Do they think you're a pain? Do they think you're never around? Do they think that you're whatever else it might be? What do people say about you? Top right, what would you like to happen in your life? What would you like to happen in your world? You know, what would be a fantasy for you? What would be a hope for you? These are all instinctive, so you don't spend too much time, it's just there. And finally, bottom right, who in your life makes a difference to you? Who in your life is the person that helps you, that supports you, that drives you or gives you space? That might not be a person who's alive, that may be a person that's passed. It might be not a person, it may be somebody or something in your life. But who makes a difference in your life? Now, we do these for all of our children throughout the whole thing. So what's true about mum? What do people say about mum? What would I like to happen with mum? Who can help mum? What's true about school? What do people say about me at school? What would I like to happen at school? Who can help me? What's true about contact? What do people say about me at contact? What do I want to happen at contact? Who can help me? And what we have here is a beautiful little model that allows you to see my shoes. If you're in my shoes, Richard, this is how I see. And we could do this with the carer, with birth family, with all the people around the child. And it's such a useful thing to do because really at the end of the day, all of us in this room, we are a collection of stories. So if we can understand the stories, we can understand the journey of our children. So here, for instance, what's true about my mum. I've given you this one in your pack. We do lots of other different things in problem solving. And then with our wallpaper, as we mentioned already, this little girl's vulnerable. So what does that mean? She's been told she's in care because she's vulnerable. So we can really look at difficult words and break them down. And once we've done that, we write their books. And again, I couldn't show you a book, I'm not allowed to. But if you are interested and come to any of the training, not just by me, by other people doing this work, we'll share with you books and so on and so on. It's too much to see in an hour presentation. But if you imagine these 10 statements, and imagine the work you do with your children with these 10 statements in mind, you won't go far too wrong, really. You know, we have a winner coaching aspect, which is the children we work with will never overwhelm us. If they believe that we can hear anything, then it's okay. So I very much, when I work with my children, say, you can tell me anything you want. It's okay. I've heard lots of different things. It's all right. You tell me whatever you want to tell me. And because I believe that, I hope the children believe that too. In the same way, it's not your fault. You have choice. There are people that have been there before. You're not the only one. With their books, the books are normally 100 pages long. The books are just a representation of the wallpaper. We don't write anything out that we haven't talked about in the wallpaper. Their books take 3 months to get to the child because we want them to settle. We want to make sure that they've settled before we finish completely. And we drip feed the book in 12 pages at a time. So when the child gets the book at the end of the process, it's not just one big book all about me. It's a book I have edited. So we make our children editors-in-chief. And finally, if all this goes to plan, we end up at 9 months with our wallpaper, with our books being sorted. Then we see change. I put some messages from research in your pack, so I won't go through those. But I would like you to read this bit, and this is my last soiree, as it were. This is a girl that's an adopted young person, and she has written a chapter for a book that's coming out next year. But within this chapter, she said, Richard, could you use this for the next training you do? And that was in October, so I thought I'd use it again. So I'm sure you can all read this, but you can see that she's saying that she was stuck, that, you know, she was going through lots of problems. She was crash dieting, self-harming, and mum wasn't coping. So we went in and did life story work. And at the end of the work, she said, I was told that I would not cope with school exams. I did. I exceeded all expectations and passed them at high level. I'm now studying art at college after getting A stars. I'm still cautious with trust, but I'm now making friends of my own, enjoying this. Everybody needs TLSW, but especially if you're adopted. The trauma has mostly gone on the wallpaper instead of being locked up in me. I have learned to let it out and let it go. I bounce back quicker. I'm much happier me. I have new goals and I want to achieve. Now, this young person is, quite exceptional in what she's achieved, but she's not exceptional in the outcomes we get with this work. And in February and May next year in Melbourne, this will become evidence-based practice. So we've had a 4-year study. It's just coming out with its outcomes. I've already seen the outcomes, which is good. But what it means basically is that we have something that in England they've been funding, even though it's not evidence-based, now becoming evidence-based. And the stories of young people like this are multitude stories. If we can hold our children, hear their stories, make sense of their stories with our children, and then help them understand that their stories don't define them, their stories are their journey, and that they are able to define their futures, then we can make all the difference in the world. I hope that's been interesting. I hope that I've covered most things, and my voice managed it, so I'm really quite pleased. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Hiya. Oh, okay. Given that last girl said everybody needs therapeutic life story work, especially if you're adopted, does every child in care, or how much of therapeutic life story work does every child who comes into care need?
So, I think that it depends really much on what's being evidenced. So, for instance, not every single child would benefit from a 9-month piece of work. So if you have a young person that has particular challenges where it's, placements under stress that they've broken down or about to break down, if you've got children who are multi-placed children, this is not adopted young people, but multi-placed, or adoptions which broken down, which have led to multi-placements afterwards, which we see quite a lot. Children who are self-harming, children who have sexual behaviours, children who have behaviours which are frightening for them and frightening for those around them, this is really good stuff. If you're working with a young person that is fairly settled, but ask the questions of why do I live here and why was my mum not able to look after me, we have what we call More About Me, which is the same thing, but it's much more targeted to the journey of why. So, for instance, in special guardianship, that's a really good way of working, because the family story is often kept by the special guardianship, because it's often a connected carer. But the story about why I don't live with my mum or my dad may be the confusing story. So that's why we would use this. Same process, but we would make it much more targeted. For every child, though, what we like is what's called an All About Me book. And an All About Me book is one that's done every 6 months. So as soon as the child comes into the sphere of the local authority, every 6 months, ideally, that child would be doing an All About Me book for them if they're young, and then by them as they get older. Now, if you had a child coming into an adoption placement, say a year-old, and the adoptive parents would do an All About Me book, a year-old, 18 months, 2 years, and so on, and then they took over and were encouraged to do that when they're 18 years old, they'll end up with 36 books, 20 pages each book, so they'll end up with 720-page book telling the story of my journey, co-authored, no need for life story work. We're also getting this happening in schools. So a lot of schools now are doing therapeutic life story work where we have children within the school systems that aren't managing well. So as an example, CMAB have been doing some work with me around therapeutic life story work up in Scotland, around those kind of young people that are finding themselves in families which aren't working and finding themselves as the reason for maybe those families not working. And when we break it all down, actually, it's not necessarily that situation. And that is about, not allowing their past to define their current. So there are step downs.
And in terms of the evidence-based practice that you just said that this was going into, are we getting to a point where we can very clearly, and the same as like the ACEs stuff and the trauma stuff, that we can very clearly say this is not an opinion, this is not a idea or a way of working, this is something that has to happen in various, like in a variety of ways, like because I'm a therapist, it would be like along with the child's process, like led by them, but it's not like a luxury extra kind of thing. Sure.
So when I first started this in 97, sorry, it's very echoey, so I'm trying to catch all your words. When I started in 97 in a residential unit, it was costing a lot of money to do this work, and 2 years into it, we had a lot of the directorate group said, it's luxury. And so I kind of thought, oh my God, what am I going to do? Because I've really worked hard, blah, blah, blah. I was asked to do a research by our manager of human resources. And I thought, okay. So I did it. And she said, make sure I get a copy of your questionnaire. And what we found was, I didn't know this, but she was able then to say it, every adult that did life story work with a child no longer went sick, weren't leaving. Were actually staying the course for the child because suddenly there was a relationship between them and their child where they were making sense. Now, what we have in the concept of my last thing that I wrote in 2017 was that every child at 7 years old, in my opinion, who is adopted before they're 7 years old, should by rights have a therapeutic life story work provision. Because that's when we all know children are saying, who am I? If we wait, then other things start to happen in that child's world, which gets in the way of telling that story as well as we could tell it. So we know that at 11-year-olds, it's who am I and who are you? So there's still that curiosity, but there's lots of stuff going on in their worlds. At 13, it's who am I and who the hell are you? So they're already starting to move away from their families. They're already starting to do things to protect themselves by going into other herds, if you like, often not so good for them. So the point is, when do we do this work, if we do it? If you're asking me, should it be a matter of practice? Absolutely. And it should replace life story books, and it should replace later life letters. It should be that there is a commitment to families that this will be available to them. In the same way, there should be mandatory sharing of practice to our carers and our families looking after children who have gone through systems. Because I had a big argument with a minister in Australia, in Queensland, where I said to them, how do you expect our carers and adopters to look after children if you don't tell them their child's story? Because you put both hands behind their back, you ask them to hop and look after the most challenging children. So the more we tell our families, the more we share with our families, the more likely we'll have healthiness. So I think I would say it should be a right. Yeah. But then I would, wouldn't I? But you know what I mean. Yeah.
Do you bang up against data protection issues when you're trying to take information from a child's background that's about their family because you feel that it's important to tell the parents or adoptive parents or carers?
Sure.
Does that ever cause a
So
problem?
information gathering can be challenging. It's also quite frightening. If you're an adoptive mum, for instance, and I go off and see a family of origin member, what does that mean? Equally, a family of origin member can't be quite frightened because clearly they've had that kind of stop. So I think it's about the way we do it, it's the thought behind how we do it. But the more that we can hear the story of the family of origin, the more likely we can make difference for the child. And I guess it's the best way of saying it is this: most of us working with children aren't working with the child, we're working with the emerging adult. So if we think around working with the emerging adult, what's this child going to be? The more we can help that emerging adult understand what's happened and why it's happened, the less likely we're going to have the behaviour resemble itself in their adulthood. So it is about breaking cycles in that way too. So I have a lot of adopted mums and dads say, oh, they're just like their birth family mum or dad. And I'll go, well, what gives you that experience? Well, because what we know. What do you know? And then we can actually get rid of those myths, really. I hope that answered that question okay.
Thank you, Richard. That's been great.